we're dealing with a pandemic right now, and we might wonder whether the Buddha had any advice to give to the sick. Well, in fact, the Buddha did, and we're going to discuss one piece of advice coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So the Buddha had a number of pieces of advice to give to people who were sick, and one particularly detailed and well-known, at least within the tradition, piece of advice are a meditation or a reflection upon 10 perceptions that the Buddha gave. The basic backstory is that there was an elderly monk, Girimananda, who was sick, who was back in his hut, and the Buddha's attendant Ananda knew about this, found out about it, went and talked to him, found out that he was sick, came to talk to the Buddha, and asked the Buddha for some piece of advice that he might relay to Girimananda. And the Buddha gave this advice, and so the Ananda brought it back, and it was supposed to be healing in the sense that once Girimananda had done this reflection, he felt better, he felt like he had been healed. So within the context of the sutta, within the context of the tradition, these are sort of taken to be healing reflections. I think, personally, I think that goes too far. They don't really heal you. No reflections can, certainly not if you have a virus or some serious illness, but what they can do is to put the illness in its place. They can give us a sort of a wiser ability to reflect upon our situation and to contextualize it, and perhaps as a result come to some calm about it, which of course will, let's say, reduce our stress, reduce our anguish, reduce our suffering, and so make us better to that degree. Before I get into the specifics of the 10, I do want to recommend this book by Bhante Gunaratana, A Meditation on Perception. Bhante Gunaratana is a traditional teacher. He's a very skilled and knowledgeable teacher, and this book actually is about just this meditation. So the whole book is really trying to explain these 10 reflections in detail from a sort of a contemporary traditional perspective. So the first one of these reflections is a reflection on the perception of impermanence. So the idea would be that Girimananda is in bed, he is ill, and he should spend time reflecting upon impermanence. That is, that all perceptions for sure are impermanent. They come and go. All aspects of our lived reality are impermanent. Our bodies are impermanent in the sense that our body will eventually decay. We will get sick. As we know, Girimananda is sick. So we know that the body will get sick. We will get, if we're lucky, we'll become old. We will eventually die. So the body is impermanent. Also the mind is impermanent. Perceptions are impermanent. Feelings are impermanent. That is to say, sometimes we have pleasant feelings, and other times, like the present, let's say, if we're ill, we're having unpleasant feelings. But we know that these are impermanent. They're going to go away after a time. And that can give us some solace to realize that the situation that we're in now isn't going to last forever. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be for the better. There's a very funny story by Ajahn Brahm, who was a contemporary Theravada teacher, who talks about an experience he had with his teacher, the very famous Thai meditation master Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Brahm tells about one time that Ajahn Brahm, had gotten sick while he was in Thailand, I believe it was, and he was so sick that he had to go to the hospital. And so he was, as a result, in the hospital alone for long periods of time, feeling rather sorry for himself. And at one point, Ajahn Chah, this eminent meditation master, came to visit him. And of course, this was a great boon to Ajahn Brahm. He was very happy to see his teacher there, who had made a long trip just to see him. And Ajahn Chah, obviously, after saying a number of things and being very kind to him, Ajahn Chah said, Well, there's two options. Either you're going to get better or you're going to die. And then with that, he left. And this, John Brahm tells, when he tells this story, he tells it sort of in a laughing way because it's very blunt advice. But it is the advice of impermanence, which is to say we're not, I mean, we shouldn't take impermanence to always mean that things are going to get better when they're bad. Sometimes we die. These things happen. But it's an example of the fact that we will not have to deal with the situation forever, one way or another. The second one of these perceptions is a perception on non-self, is to become aware through direct seeing, if we can, that nothing around us is ourself, is who we are. Certainly our perceptual apparatus is not who we are, our eyes and ears and nose and tongue and so on. The things that we experience are not who we are. The world around us isn't who we are. Our body isn't who we are. What we hear and what we taste and smell is not who we are. And this kind of reflection upon all that we can perceive, all that we can feel, can help us to relax around the normal tendency that we all have to feel sorry for ourselves in situations like this. Because it can help us to understand that this is not about us. It's not personal. It has nothing to do with us. There's no self here to be concerned about in that sense. Things are simply arising and passing. And here we can also reflect upon a simile of the two arrows that I discussed in a prior video. I'll put a link to that video down below in case you haven't seen it. The Buddha gave a very famous parable of two arrows that we tend to get stuck with. We all get stuck with the first arrow, which is the arrow of physical discomfort and pain. Certainly if we're sick, we're all going to be in pain and suffering. To that extent, physical pain. However, only the non-awakened of us get hit with the second arrow. And the second arrow is this arrow of mental suffering, of dukkha in the Buddhist sense, of a feeling of unsatisfactoriness, of taking things personally. And this comes about because we tend to identify with and cling to pleasant sensations and identify ourselves in contrast to unpleasant sensations. So we think of the illness as something that isn't who we really are, and so we sort of push it away. And we get angry at it. We feel personally affronted by it. And as a result, we get ourselves into all kinds of mental operations and mental obsessions, which constitute suffering in the Buddhist sense. So if we can undertake this meditation, or I should say this reflection on the perception of non-self, or at least I should say try to see non-self, I mean we actually do the perception of non-self, that can help us to extricate ourselves from that second arrow. The third perception that the Buddha recommends is a perception of ugliness or non-beauty. It depends how we translate the Pali term. I would say it's non-beauty. That is to say, getting ourselves away from our ordinary tendency to see ourselves, our body, as beautiful. And many of us may have grown up in a Western culture where we're trained to sort of see the body as beautiful, and there certainly are reasons to do that. That can be skillful practice in some circumstances. I'm not going to deny that, but the point here is to release clinging to the body by seeing that it has non-beautiful elements, that it's not the sort of thing that we should identify with as who I am. And we do that through this awareness of non-beauty. So, for example, when we're sick, the non-beauty of the body often comes out directly. We certainly don't look ourselves, we may not look beautiful, we may not look well. We may have to deal with things such as runny noses, such as being sick, that is to say vomiting, that is to say having diarrhea, these kinds of unpleasant kinds of things that the body does when we're ill. And we can turn away from those. We often do turn away from those. Again, perfectly natural, but if we are able to at least turn towards them to an extent that we understand that the body is not inherently beautiful, that has both beautiful and non-beautiful aspects, that all beauty and non-beauty is really just a matter of how we look at it. That's really the more wise way to approach the thing. Then that'll help us to cease identification with it. The fourth perception that the Buddha recommends is a perception of drawbacks or dangers. And the idea here is that we are to perceive and see and feel within ourselves the drawbacks of life, the dangers of life. The fact that we are all prone to old age, to sickness, and to death. In particular sickness, because we can perceive the sickness right now. That's the idea. We're doing this reflection while we're ill. And it's an idea of saying that this is part of life. Once again, we will say, it's not about me, it's not about you, it's not about thinking that we're special and being somehow singled out by having some illness, but rather that illness is something that everybody has to undergo. Old age is something that we all have to undergo if we're lucky enough to get to old age, frankly. Death is something that we all have to undergo. These are things that are universal, and that is part of the depth and wisdom of the Buddha's teaching, is to make us aware of the universality of these experiences, that these dangers are, in the final analysis, not dangers that we can overcome somehow. There's nothing that we can, there's no potion we can take, there's no place we can go to get away from these. They're with all of us. And once again, having that awareness through perception, through direct perception, well, that's a way of perceiving the First Noble Truth. Many of us will know the First Noble Truth is the truth of dukkha, is the Pali word, or sometimes translated as suffering, or as I would prefer, unsatisfactoriness. This is oftentimes difficult for us to see. Many of us, especially in the modern world, many of us in the West, are trained to sort of think of life as very rosy. But if we're caught in that kind of illusion, we're never really going to make progress. The progress comes, I think, when we have the spur of seeing these dangers, and therefore coming to see directly the truth of that First Noble Truth. The fifth perception is a perception of abandoning. And here the idea is that we're perceiving ourselves abandoning unwholesome states. And we can perhaps think of it as Girimananda lying down in the bed, or we ourselves lying down in a bed, seeing unwholesome states, perhaps anger, ill will, perhaps a greed for future pleasures. He sees them arise in his mind and witnesses, that is to say, perceives himself abandoning these things, perceives himself leaving those behind, understanding, seeing that they're not useful, that they don't actually make life any better to have these kinds of afflictive mental states. We're dealing with the affliction of the illness. That's affliction enough. We don't need to add to it with other unpleasant mental states. So that's the fifth. Now, the sixth and seventh are a perception of cessation and dispassion, or actually it's the reverse, dispassion and cessation. Now, these two I'm not going to say a whole lot about. It's not entirely clear to me why they are in this list, at least why they're in this list at that place, because dispassion and cessation are ordinarily the kinds of terms that we associate with awakening. Dispassion means a losing of the afflictive passions of greed, hatred, and hatred in particular. And cessation would be an awareness, a perception of the cessation of something like a greed, of something like a thirst, this kind of attachment we have to ourselves and to the world. And these are associated with awakening. We can perhaps understand that this dispassion and this cessation are things that Girimananda is aware of at least becoming stronger within himself, that he's seeing them increase, that the passions are fading away, the cessation is becoming more clear to him, and so that's the sort of thing perhaps that he's aware of. Now, I think the last three of these perceptions are particularly interesting. They raise a number of particularly deep issues, I think, with practice. And so let's keep that in mind when we talk about them. The eighth is a perception of non-delight or dissatisfaction with the entire world. And this is a very strong kind of thing to meditate upon, to think about, to reflect upon, certainly to perceive. A perception of non-delight or dissatisfaction with the entire world. But the idea here is that in this illness, Girimananda is able to, or the Buddha suggests Girimananda should spend time simply becoming detached in an emotional sense, or I shouldn't say detached, because that suggests that we don't care about the world. That's not the way we're supposed to be thinking here, but rather that we're non-attached to the world, that we're in a position of non-identification with the world, that we're seeing, again, we're seeing the drawbacks, we're seeing the dangers in the world, and so we're seeing a kind of dissatisfaction. This is, again, part and parcel of seeing the First Noble Truth. We're seeing that the world is, from a particular point of view, unsatisfactory. And in so doing, we're giving up our mental obsessions and our mental fixations about the world. This is one of the ways that this is explained in the sutta. We're giving up our kind of ordinary, knee-jerk type fixations on things that we really want and things that we really don't want, the kinds of things that tend to make our mind spin and spin and spin when we're in situations we either like or don't like. This also, another thing it involves is our giving up attachment to viewpoints, to views, to beliefs. This doesn't mean that we don't think things are true or false, but rather that we stop identifying with that truth. We stop identifying ourselves against things that are false. We give up the kind of emotional attachment to viewpoints, the kind of attachment that makes us very angry when somebody disagrees with us, or makes us very pleased when someone agrees with us. These are the kinds of things that we're trying to give up. And this attitude of dissatisfaction with the entire world can be one way into that. The ninth perception is said to be a perception of non-desire for all conditions, for all conditioned phenomena. Now, I should say that this particular description is a variant reading. There are a couple of different readings of what this ninth one might be, but this particular description I've just given, it fits the actual content of the text beneath it, so I think this is probably right. In any event, the idea here, the Buddha explains, is that we are to have, we're to perceive distress, shame, and disgust for all conditioned phenomena. This is very strong, and I think highlights one of the ways that the early Buddhist kind of presentation of the Dharma is oftentimes quite different from a presentation of the Dharma that we find nowadays. Nowadays, we may hear, one famous teacher talks about radical acceptance, that not only are we supposed to accept the world, but we're supposed to radically accept it, accept every part of it. Well, there's more to be said about that, but in any event, in this particular context, we are instead to feel really disgust, shame, turn away from the world in this sense. And that is perhaps something that the Buddha believes Girimananda is going to be able to get at through his illness. The illness is difficult, the illness is painful, the illness is not going to be the kind of thing that anyone's going to want to have to live through. And by using that as a spur to his practice, he's able to get to this kind of a place of non-identification. Non-identification with his body, non-identification with the world, non-identification with all conditioned phenomena, which is all things that surround us, which we can see, feel, hear, taste, touch, and all the rest. That is, through perceiving this distress, this disgust, this shame in ourselves towards all conditioned phenomena, we may get ourselves to a position of seeing that all this phenomena of our internal mind, ourself, and the world is not worth clinging to. And I think the process here is by seeing that it's not worth clinging to, by seeing that first noble truth, we cease clinging. The clinging ceases on its own. That is to say, by seeing the difficulty, by seeing the danger, by seeing the distress involved in the world, we cease to wish to cling. The clinging dries up on its own. And therefore, we get ourselves to a much farther place on the path through these kinds of meditations, through this kind of perception. Now, the 10th and last perception that the Buddha recommends is a perception of breathing. And here in the sutta, the Buddha goes through a number of different practices involving mindfulness of breathing, if you like, or perception of the breath, which serve in one way or another to calm down the mind. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them. It's a lengthy list. You can read it. I've got a link to the sutta down in the show notes below, and of course you can also look at Bhante Munaratana's book if you want more. But the basic idea here is that it's a list of different kinds of perceptions of the breath that we can use, using it as a method to, again, to calm down the mind after what has been a very difficult series of practices. As we've seen already, these practices can be upsetting for some of us, I think, difficult at the very least, and not the sort of things we would ordinarily want to perceive. We tend to turn away from the kinds of perceptions that the Buddha is suggesting we look at in this sutta. Which brings me back to the question that I just talked about a couple of seconds ago, which is this strange, interesting, and I think very fruitful kind of difference between the direction that we find in early Buddhism for practice and the direction that we often get nowadays. In particular, this difference between this perception of the distress involved in the world that may make us relax around clinging, versus a more contemporary kind of view of the world, this radical acceptance. Tara Brach is a very accomplished psychologist and meditation teacher around nowadays who recommends radical acceptance. Now, I did an earlier video on this difference between acceptance that we find nowadays and really escape that we find in the early suttas. These can be reconciled in various ways. They're not necessarily completely distinct. They can be seen as two sides of the same coin, depending on how we frame the difference. And as I said, I did an earlier video. I'll put a link to it up on the screen, and I would recommend you might want to take a look at it. Thanks so much to all of you, and thanks to my Patreon patrons. If you want to join them, please click the link down below, and I'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.